one of the reasons we've done this, because as business people, we aren't the best communicators about the reasons we make our living this way. So we bring in these expert advocates for free markets and limited government, and ask them to speak for us. And about 15 years ago, Larry and I became friends at the Foundation for Economic Education, and their magazine, The Free Man, which lies on our entryway coffee table, 5 times a year, carries a column by Larry Reed. So you probably have read him, even if you haven't met him until today. So it's with a great deal of pleasure that I bring Larry Reed, who is the president of his Michigan think tank, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and I'm going to ask him to speak for me.
Okay. Thanks, Ethel May. Thanks, everybody. She didn't tell you this, but I've referred to Ethel May for a number of years now as my Missouri mom. And I don't have moms in all 50 states. And she's very, very special. So I really appreciate this opportunity and look forward to spending this hour with you. I have a little icebreaker to open with I thought you'd get a kick out of. I'm an economist, but not the kind that regals you with number after number. This is more of a rhetorical presentation than it is a numerical one. And so you might appreciate this little bit of arithmetic. If all of the milk produced in this nation in 1 year was in quart containers and lined up side by side as it is on the grocer's shelves, this line would reach around the earth at the equator 140 times. Or if these same quart containers were stacked one on top of the other, this stack would reach to the moon 30 times. Or if we had a river that reached from Boston to San Francisco, 3,000 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, it would hold only 1 year's production of milk in this country. If all the people employed in the dairy industry were made into one giant man, it would take 1 full year's cotton crop to make him a pair of overalls. I never have found out, by the way, who did these numbers. I've always assumed it was probably on a federal grant. If all of the cows in the country that produced 1 day's supply of milk were in one giant cow, her left front foot would be in Lake Michigan, her right front foot would be in Lake Erie, her left hind foot would be in the Gulf of Mexico, and her right hind foot would be in the Caribbean Sea. She could switch flies off the equator with her tail, tear up the St. Lawrence Seaway with her horns, and lick the mist off the northern lights with her tongue. And finally, according to these calculations, if she eats the normal amount of green grass and her body functions are normal, standing in this position in Cuba, located where it is, we should be able to take care of Castro once and for all. Well, my subject this morning is the Standard Oil story. I think maybe the full title we gave it was Witch Hunting for Robber Barons, the Standard Oil Story. I usually give it under that title. And it's a great story of American entrepreneurship with a lot of myths that are debunked in the course of this next 45 minutes. And I want to begin by reminding you that there is a common conception out there, which I regard as a myth, that the latter part of the 19th century in America was a time of increasing monopoly and decreasing competition. The myth, as most students learn in high schools these days, would have us believe that this was the era of the robber barons and the American economy was becoming increasingly concentrated and monopolistic, less and less competitive. That's the generally accepted view of things. But I want to present to you a different thesis and then use the story of the great boogeyman Standard Oil to help demonstrate it. And the thesis I want to present has a name to it. It's called the Kolko thesis, K-O-L-K-O, named for Gabriel Kolko, who, I should add, is a socialist. He doesn't agree with me, maybe many of you, on general public policy ideas today. He believes in bigger government. And yet, he is a superb historian, and he wrote a book that those of us who believe in free markets have widely embraced, quite enthusiastic about. He wrote it some 25, 30 years ago. And he has a very different thesis about the American economy in the latter part of the 19th century. I like to cite him because then a critic is a little bit less quick to say, well, this is just more free market propaganda. I can say, wait a minute, this is a socialist saying this. He took a look at industry after industry and arrived at a thesis, now called the Kolko thesis, which is that in the latter half of the 19th century, the American economy was becoming more competitive and less concentrated, less monopolistic in industry after industry, just the opposite of what most of us have been taught. And in fact, he looked at particular industries that have been charged with things like predatory price cutting and collusion and conspiracy to restrict output and raise prices. And he found that, yeah, there were attempts to do those sorts of things on occasion, but he said he couldn't find a single one that actually worked for very long at all. And that most of the time, these secret agreements that were attempted to restrict output and raise prices actually didn't last any longer than it took for the ink to dry on them, for reasons I'll go into in some detail in just a moment. Well, that's quite a different perspective than what we typically have learned. And to drive this home, I want to use the story of the Standard Oil Company to make these points. Standard Oil is the great boogeyman. Any conventional high school, even college history text will present Standard Oil as the number one boogeyman, the worst of the robber barons, the company that just ran roughshod over other people, built this massive empire, controlled markets, pushed people around, drove competitors out, abused consumers, and what have you. And if you go back and look at these texts, you may, with a critical eye, be amazed at how much is simply presented as if it's fact with no documentation. Just mere assertions, as if everybody just knows that this was all the case. A very little attempt most of the time to elaborate and provide much detail. Does anybody know what Americans used for lighting in their homes in the decades before kerosene, which is what the Standard Oil Company at first was producing? What were we using before we switched to a crude oil product, kerosene? Any guesses? Animal fat, whale oil in particular, absolutely. Whale oil was the prevailing fuel for lighting for decades, well into the 19th century, in fact into the 1860s, until companies like Standard discovered ways to take crude oil from below the earth and refine it into a usable product. But something interesting began to happen by the early part of the 19th century. We had increasing demand through industrialization for more lighting, more fuel, more whale oil. But whales were owned kind of communally. You know, they're common property, owned by nobody. In effect, sometimes people would say, well, then they're owned by everybody, but that reduces to being owned by nobody. And as a result, there was incentive to use the supply and draw it down, but very little incentive for anybody, and maybe we didn't have the technology anyway, to grow the supply or to conserve it. So every incentive to use and abuse, but not to conserve and to grow. So what do you suppose happened in this era of no federal government price controls on whale oil as the demand rose and the supply didn't keep up? Prices soared. Through the early decades of the 19th century, prices were going up. How we managed this without a Department of Energy is beyond me. But we didn't have a bureaucracy charged with managing a problem into perpetuity. And instead, we allowed the market to do its thing. And the rising prices for whale oil caused a couple things to happen. One, it crimped demand. Some people found ways to do with less, some very creatively. People found that, you know, maybe maybe I can concentrate my reading during the daytime instead of after dark. Or they found any number of ways to make do with less. But more importantly, what happened on the supply side is what changed the world. The higher prices for whale oil acted as a powerful incentive for entrepreneurs to find an alternative. And there was this stuff surfacing on the creeks of northwestern Pennsylvania, known to the Indians. They were using it for war paint and things like that. And it was known to be flammable. And the question in the minds of these early oil entrepreneurs was, is this stuff commercially viable? Can we find it in large enough quantity, bring it forth at a reasonable cost, and do enough to it to make it a clean burning fuel? And so in the 1850s, there was a search to find how to make this stuff more usable, and where it came from and in what quantity. And it was in 1859 in my home state of Pennsylvania, at a little place called Titusville, where Colonel Edwin Drake was the first to strike oil in the form of a gusher. It really was. When he hit it, it just blew through the contraption he had built to sink the well and blew oil all over the place. But that's an interesting story because Drake was sent by a consortium of Connecticut businessmen to northwestern Pennsylvania to try to find this stuff in large enough quantity and see what he could do with it. He ran out of the money they gave him. They said, come on back, forget it, it's probably not going to work. And he went out on a limb and borrowed another $500, and that was about gone when he struck this gusher. And that was the start of a tremendous oil boom. If you've ever seen photographs, and there are a lot of them around, of what the hills of western Pennsylvania looked like in the 1860s and 70s, if you looked at them from a distance, you think, wow, lots of trees on that mountain. You look closer and you see they're not trees, they're derricks. Oil derricks being built and wells being sunk all over the mountains of western Pennsylvania. In later years, John D Rockefeller will testify in Congress about this period, and he will point out that, in his words, it seemed like everybody and his brother was sinking a well in northwestern Pennsylvania. A lot of chaos in the sense that you had people who really didn't know much about what to do with the stuff once they brought it forth, and a lot of accidents and what have you, and boom towns followed by ghost towns and what have you. And there was quite a shakeout in later years as the better entrepreneurs assumed mastery over the business. Well, in this chaotic atmosphere, in the early oil boom, emerges a young man named John D Rockefeller. And I know that we associate that name today with great wealth, but John D was not born into great wealth. He didn't have a silver spoon in his mouth. He was a bookkeeper, he was a grocer, and by the way, he was a man from his early teens who regularly, faithfully tithed to his church. And in fact, kept meticulous records. You can still see at one of his estates outside of Irvington, New York, in fact. You can see his records that he kept meticulously over the years of how he spent all of his money and how much he tithed to his church. He saved his money, he borrowed some more, and in 1865 he co-founded a partnership in the oil refining business. And in 1870, just 5 years later, he formed the Standard Oil Company, 1870. And it was focused not so much on the discovery and the drilling, but on the refining of crude oil. In 1870, the first year of the Standard Oil Company, he had 4% of the oil refining business, 4%. 4% of all the oil refined in the country was refined by John D. Rockefeller at Standard Oil. In 1890, 20 years later, that market share will be 90%. And that's the source of many of the monopoly charges. You have people who seem to think that that's all you need to know. 90%, that's too much. You had to run roughshod over somebody. How do you get 90% unless you have done some things that you shouldn't have done? And usually for some of these anti-market folks, that's all they need. 90%, nobody should have that much. They don't know, or at least they don't tell you, that that 90% share was fleeting. It didn't last very long for reasons I'll mention in just a moment. They don't tell you what Standard did to achieve such a high degree of customer sovereignty or customer patronage. Rockefeller steadily improved the refined product, kerosene, and steadily cut the price. This was a time, in fact, just look at these numbers. From 1863, the price of kerosene was going for 45 cents a gallon in 1863. 1873, it had fallen to 6 cents a gallon. And this is the period where he's getting into the business. And midway in that period, he starts the Standard Oil Company. Meantime, the price of kerosene plummets, and it will keep plummeting on a steadily improving quality product for the next 20 years. It's important to note that even at Standard's short-run peak share of the market in 1890, 90%, that there were 66 other companies in the same business. Now, they were very tiny, and altogether they only made up 10% of the market. But they were all, like he was at one time, ready, eager, and willing to expand the moment there was such an opportunity. And some of them did. Some of the giants of a few years later, the Pure Oil Company, the Sun Oil Company, are among the 66 that he faces in 1890. Now, I believe that Standard achieved this high market share not because of evil, destructive actions against consumers and competitors, not because it got special privileges from the government to give it advantage over others, but because it is what economists sometimes call a classic efficiency monopoly. Now, the very term monopoly doesn't really apply here, but we use it nonetheless. But an efficiency monopoly is a company that gets a high market share because it does the best job. Not because it's got any artificial advantages bestowed upon it by the government, but because it does such a superb job that people say, that's who I want to buy from. And the question is, well, how did it get to that point? And how long did it last? And how free were competitors to do battle with it? Let me advance 3 reasons why that market share was so short-term. In fact, years before, the Supreme Court in 1911 famously broke up the Standard Oil Trust for questionable reasons. Years before that happened, Standard's share had already fallen well below 70%. Here are 3 reasons why. No entrepreneur has a permanent mastery of market conditions. Sooner or later, somebody else is going to get an edge. In the case of Rockefeller, he thought that the oil boom would, for the foreseeable future, be concentrated where he found the stuff, in northwestern Pennsylvania and in Ohio. He probably believed what the U.S. Geological Survey pronounced in 1890. It said, no oil will be found in Texas. So he's focused on Pennsylvania, seriously, he's focused on Pennsylvania and Ohio, and other entrepreneurs are a little quicker to see opportunities elsewhere. And so Texas becomes developed with Rockefeller way behind in that sphere. Another reason is, remember, he's making money taking crude oil and refining it into kerosene. But by the 1890s, what's Edison done that's going to chip away at any firm that's simply making crude oil or kerosene? Yeah, electricity is coming on, a competitor to kerosene for fuel. And also, what other product is coming along that people can take crude oil and refine it into a product that can be used in? The automobile, right? Well, Rockefeller was a little slow to see that, and others said, hey, we can jump into this market and make this stuff called gasoline and really take off and become an ever larger company. He was a little slow to see that. This is because in a free market, competition is a dynamic, never-ending leapfrog process. A dynamic, never-ending leapfrog process, whereby the leader today can easily become the follower tomorrow. And if you look at a list of the Fortune 500 of, say, 1940, and then Fortune 500, 1950, 1960, every 10 years, you'll discover an incredible degree of mortality of companies that were huge in their day and thought to be, on the landscape forever. They're now history, gone. Nobody knows what happened to them. Absorbed by someone else, overtaken because they didn't stay on top of things. Somebody else saw an opportunity more quickly than they did. Well, having said that, I think we need to focus some attention on the specific charges that have been leveled against Standard Oil. I've presented to you a very broad brush view of a company that I think grew because it was the best. I didn't mention a few of those details, by the way, but while I think of them, I'll also tell you that Rockefeller was known for having an uncanny ability to find the right people to be around him. He knew how to find the Archbalds and the Flaglers and the geniuses who could coax more kerosene out of a barrel of crude than anybody else. He just had a knack for that. He didn't lord it over others in his company. He found the best, and he encouraged them and rewarded them, and they helped to carry the company to new heights. Time and again, even his critics acknowledged the fine people he brought around him and how skilled they were and how long they stayed with him. He was just very good at that. One time, there's a famous story, too, about his cost saving. He was quite the penny pincher. He went through his refineries, and he watched every process along the way, including the construction of barrels that the kerosene went into. And, you know, they're made of wood with metal staves around the circumference. And he started to notice how many drops of solder that they were using on the metal staves to hold the wood together, and decided those barrels will hold up just fine with 2 drops of solder less per barrel. And so he started instructing the men to use 2 drops less. Never had a problem with barrels breaking open, and you wouldn't think that 2 drops would make a difference, but you multiply that by, you know, millions and millions of barrels over time, that added up to a nice savings. He was famously uncanny with his ability to find such opportunities and then make sure they were implemented. The first charge I want to deal with is predatory price cutting. Predatory price cutting. This is the one that gets probably the most attention in the typical history text. The idea that the big guy is able, simply because he's big, to slash his prices, and then in the midst of a price war, he can drive all the little guys out and wait out the storm, and when they're gone, he can then raise his prices in a market devoid of competition. Before I explain to you why that is a lot easier said than done, let me tell you a famous example of a predatory price-cutting war and how it turned out. It goes back to my little town of Midland, Michigan, the home of the Dow Chemical Company. Herbert Henry Dow started the company in Midland in the 1890s, and what he was doing was taking the very briny water we have in Midland. If you've ever talked to anybody from Midland who's out in the township and using well water, they'll tell you how bad our water is. They were taking the water and producing bromine from it. That was his primary product, bromine, used in, I think, certain medicines, maybe as a cleaning agent, some other things. Anyway, he's making bromine, and as this tiny little company, and here comes a representative from a German bromine cartel, several big German companies that had dominated the world market with the help of the German government. They come over to Midland and they sit down with Dow and they tell him, don't you dare sell bromine outside of the United States. Because if you do, we'll ruin you. We'll run you out of business. We'll come in and dump the stuff so cheaply, we'll break you. Well, Herbert Henry Dow was the kind of guy who would just laugh at such things. He wasn't about to do what the Germans told him to do. And so with the world price at 46 cents a pound, Dow begins selling anywhere and everywhere at 36 cents a pound. The Germans really get ticked off at this, and they effectively say, well, we warned you. And so they start dumping bromine in the U.S. and elsewhere at 15 cents a pound, intending to break him and run him out of business. They figured, look, we're the big guys. We got the German government on our side. This is a little pipsqueak with 50 employees in Midland, Michigan. We can run him out in no time at all. Well, unlike the classic textbook presentation of an entrepreneur, they're not fragile little glass balls that get blown away or stepped on by the big guy without a little bit of resourcefulness coming to mind. And so here's what Dow did. He had agents, the Germans didn't know that these agents were his, buy all the 15-cent bromine that these dummies from Germany would dump wherever, repackage it, and sell it for 36 cents a pound in their own backyard. And they kept wondering, where's all this demand coming from? Well, golly, we better meet it, because if we don't, that's a customer for Dow. So they kept flooding the stuff at 15 cents. He kept buying it, repackaging it, selling it for 36 cents. I mean, that's a great way to do business. It's a relatively low risk, and you don't even have to invest in the plant and equipment. The other guy's doing it for you. So anyway, the Germans finally threw in the towel and realized this was an unwinnable war. And when they did, there's Dow sitting on some handsome profits and a nice, growing, booming business. And that's the beginning of the Dow Chemical Company to this day. So To this day, it owes an important element of its origins and early growth to that price war with the Germans. Now, there's a case of predatory price cutting, but the predator was the dummy who turned out to be the prey. And it was the would-be prey that turned out to be the predator, you might say. Well, let's explain why predatory price cutting as a theory is much more difficult to implement than much more easy to talk about than it is to implement. There was a path-breaking article on this very subject written in the October 1958 Journal of Law and Economics by Professor John McGee from the University of Chicago. McGee's an interesting character because he had just assumed that Rockefeller did this. That's what he learned too in high school. But he found there was a dearth of evidence and a dearth of research on the subject. He just found assertions that Rockefeller did this. He wanted to be the guy that kind of explored it and laid it out and explained step by step. And lo and behold, he discovered that Rockefeller didn't do it. And he asserts in his article that furthermore, he would have been stupid to have tried it. And here's how he goes about in his article making that case. He said, first of all, you can look at the empirical record. Prices aren't secrets. I mean, you can see what the price of kerosene was. And he said, all during this time that Rockefeller's firm was getting larger, the 1870s and 80s and into the 90s, the price of kerosene doesn't look like this, doesn't go down and up. It's steadily down. In real terms and nominal terms, it's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And guess what? The quality of the product is getting better and better all the time. So McGee said, if you just look at the record, you have to wonder where is the point at which the price spikes because the predator is cashing in on his policy. It never happened. And then he goes into economic theory and explains how that tells us why predatory price cutting is far harder to ever achieve than you might think. Here are several reasons why that's the case. First of all, price is only one aspect of competition. Competition takes a lot of forms. Firms compete with each other not only in terms of their prices, but in terms of their proximity to the customer, to maybe transportation advantages, ability to offer long-term, low-price contracts, service, follow-up, connections, lots of ways in which firms can compete. So the idea that price alone is enough to wipe out everybody is probably a bit of a stretch in most, if not all, cases. So even the predatory price-cutting theorist argues, well, yeah, we know a tiny little price difference won't be enough, but the big guy is able to slash his prices, make a big price difference, really attract the other customers, overwhelm all the other advantages that competitors might have, and make price alone the reason to win the war. But we just start out by pointing out that a minuscule price difference is probably not going to do it. It probably has to be a very substantial one, which most predatory price-cutting theorists say the big guy can easily do and absorb whatever losses are involved because he's big. Secondly, large firms stand to lose the most from this policy. Now that's counterintuitive. You might think, wait a minute, it's the big firm that's supposed to be able to do it, who has the reserves, who can withstand a prolonged war. But McGee tells us, the large firm stands to lose the most. Why? By being the largest, he's already producing the most, and now he's probably going to start incurring losses on that huge volume. But what does he have to do with his volume of production as he slashes his prices? Can he just keep it the same? No, if he doesn't increase production, all he's going to do is service his own clientele at a lower price. He has to do that and has to add to production so as to have something to sell to the competitors' customers. So he has to step up the volume of production at a time when he's got these low loss-incurring prices. And there's another reason why he has to step up production too. How will consumers react in this situation? We'll buy more, especially if we have any reason to believe that this lower price is temporary. We'll buy more and we'll stockpile it. And in fact, some of those who might buy and stockpile could be the very people that Rockefeller's trying to drive out of business. They're going to get his oil nice and cheap. And so that makes the whole thing a little bit more problematic. Let's suppose as a predator you get far enough into this that you've slashed your prices and you've withstood the war and everybody else has now left the market, now it's time to cash in. Okay, assuming you could even get that far with this. Now it's time to raise your price. If you never raised your price, if you always keep it down there and you always are producing enough to satisfy demand and keep it from going to another competitor, and if that's where it ends, I would say, how do consumers get hurt by that? That's a kind of a permanent gift. But the idea here is to be able to raise your prices back up again, not just to where they were before, but hopefully to some point even higher, now in a market devoid of competition. If Rockefeller had tried this in 1890 at his very peak, if he had been successful at driving 66 other firms out of business and now began to raise his prices again, what would that do as a signal to competition? If 66 firms were willing to compete with him when the price was here, how many will want to compete with him if it's up here? And some of these could be the former competitors who just shut down for the duration, or maybe sold out and somebody else picks them up for a song and at very low capital costs can start up and compete. It's awfully problematic that this could somehow could work. And what a predator would typically find is the moment he starts to cash in by raising his price, somebody else jumps in again and so, oh, got to slash my price again, or I drive him out. And then he goes and then he raises the price again. Oh, there's another one. And it's just a never-ending effort to try to keep people out of the market, which is extraordinarily difficult to do as long as markets are free, as long as government doesn't come in and bestow any special advantages or make it harder for newcomers to start business, that kind of thing. So these so-called beaten firms themselves may reopen and at the higher price find that it's now attractive for them to get back in the business. So McGee pointed out that this really is more easily said than done. And Gabriel Kolko in his book pointed out that he couldn't find any examples where this worked. And the empirical record suggests that it was not the case in the oil business during the time that Rockefeller was growing. A second charge is that Rockefeller bought out his competitors. You always see this in the history text too. And in fact, you may have seen that famous cartoon of Rockefeller picking the buds off a rose bush, you know, and this is the idea where here's a budding competitor, what's he do? He picks them off. He buys them, absorbs them. Now they're part of Standard instead of a competitor in a free market. If a large firm decides that it wants to embark on a policy of eliminating competition by buying it wherever it appears, it's like hanging out a sign, competitors wanted, because that's exactly what they'll get. In fact, there was a guy named Daniel P. Reighard who worked for Rockefeller for a time and later left Standard Oil and built and sold 3 successive refineries to Rockefeller, each time saying, well, I got a refinery here. I don't know whether I should start it up and produce stuff or what will you give me for it? Rockefeller bought him 3 times, 3 refineries that he built. There's lots of evidence that Standard grew through acquisition, and an entirely natural and explainable development in a market that was littered with people, large and small, thousands of oil producers, some of whom never really intended to be in the business long enough to get rich quick and be gone. And so he bought up a lot of facilities. But the question is, did he buy them because they made good economic sense, or did he buy them as part of this quest to eliminate competition? Because if he was operating under the latter assumption, he clearly failed. He never eliminated competition. There was competition all over the place, not only in the U.S., but from all over the world. The Russians had discovered oil in Baku, and they were online producing huge amounts of refined oil products for the world market. The idea that Rockefeller could just stamp out competition everywhere just by buying it, and that would be the end of it, is really rather absurd. If he had bought all 66 competitors in 1890, do you think the day afterwards, do you think there wouldn't be another 66 lining up to say, hey, why don't you buy me? Then I don't have to bother to take the risk and go into the production business. I'll just sell you the refinery. So I think this charge is a red herring too. And it doesn't stack up to all the other measures of competition that we see: falling prices, increasing production, the world being inundated with improving quality refined oil products at falling prices. Standard's own market share falling after this brief period of 90%. The third charge is collusion and conspiracy to raise and fix prices. Collusion and conspiracy to raise and fix prices. It's interesting when you think of it, the same guy's accused of all these things. You know, what did he do? Did he prey on his competitors? Did he sit down and buy them? Or did he sit down and make deals with them and conspire? I mean, the same guy gets hit with all these charges of trying to monopolize the market. Remember that the price record ought to tell us something about whether collusion and conspiracy to raise prices was attempted and whether or not it was successful, because you would expect to see price spikes, but there are none in this period. Prices steadily falling, production steadily increasing, quality of the product steadily improving throughout this period. So the record doesn't seem to support this, but I want to offer some economic reasons why these agreements to conspire and collude tend to fall apart. And if this interests you at all, I would urge you to take a look at Kolko's book, The Triumph of Conservatism, because he goes, every chapter is about a different industry, and he explains that there were attempts sometimes by entrepreneurs who had been a little frustrated by this competition springing up everywhere, wanting to bring order to the market and wanting to get together with the others and see if they could agree to keep prices high. There were attempts, but Kolko said, but they fell apart as quickly as it took for the ink to dry. And here's why. Let's imagine that I'm Rockefeller and you're my competitors and we're at a secret hideaway, and our purpose, I've called you all together because, you know, we're all racked by this competitive problem here. Every time anybody thinks they can get their price up, somebody else undercuts them. And so wouldn't it be nice if we could all agree to not do that? Well, what's the first problem we have to solve if our intent is to raise and fix prices? What do we have to do with regard to production? Well, how about more narrowly, production? If we want to get a higher price, yeah, we have to cut production. We can't be flooding the market with as much as we have been and expect that all of that to sell at a higher price. Somebody will get stuck with unsold inventories. So we have to agree to restrict production by some formula so that the higher price sticks. And so being the guy that called us all together, I make the first suggestion. I say, well, I think it'd be fair if we just all cut by 10% across the board. 10% less output, and that'll enable us to get a higher price. Are you all going to say, oh, sure, that sounds fair? Because you're all in a very different, everyone in a very unique position. Some of you are new to the business, others have very different cost structures and what have you. And you're all going to be thinking, wait a minute, 10% for him, that's like 2% for me. That'd be about the same because I'm smaller and he has so many more advantages and what have you. So you're all going to say, well, okay, John D., you cut by 10, but that's really equal to about a 2% for me and 3% for me and what have you. Remember, all of us, if we think the price is going up, we have an incentive to keep production high, right? So we have more to sell at the higher price. So it's going to be very difficult to arrive at some formula that we're all going to agree to restrict output. But let's suppose we do that. Somehow we arrive at a formula, we all agree we're going to restrict our production by a certain amount or amounts. What's the first thing that the smartest of us is going to do when we leave the room? Well, I'm going to hope that you suckers all stick to what you agreed to. I'm going to hope that you cut your production, and I'll say, yep, I'm cutting mine, thank you very much, we got a deal. And I'm going to head for the first phone, and I'm going to call your customers, and I'm going to say, you're going to soon hear about a higher price. Keep this between us. But if you buy from me now, I'll give you a discount. Why wouldn't I do that? The very reason why we got together in the first place was what? Higher profits. Now that we have an agreement, how do you make higher profits? You break the agreement, right? You don't suddenly lose the profit motive when you have a new arrangement here. Now, if you really want to make money and you've got this secret agreement, the way to make more is to cheat. Cheat on this secret agreement by working the customers of your competitors. And so all that has to happen is for somebody to lose a customer for any reason, and somebody's going to say, I smell a rat. And before long, there's an attempt, of course, by many of us to meet that problem by cutting or increasing our production, cutting our price. The agreement falls apart. That's why Coco found in his book that, yeah, a lot of these guys, they thought they were smart. They'd get the competitors together, and they thought that they were a lot of dummies, and he could talk them into agreeing to this sort of thing, fully intending, before the agreement was even signed, to break it at the earliest opportunity. Where the typical history text falls short is they just tell you that there were attempts. They don't tell you anything about the competitive forces at work that broke them apart. They just think it was an evil thing to try, but they never give the market any credit for making sure they didn't work. Coco, a socialist historian, says that's the way it happened. The economy was becoming more competitive, less monopolistic in spite of these attempts because the market was so, the winds of competition were so powerful. That's really one reason why these tend to break apart, and we sometimes call that internal pressures. We've got this agreement, and internal to the agreement itself, just the parties involved, there's great pressure to break the agreement. But let's suppose we are such people of such high standards and people of our word that nobody cheats. Everybody sticks to the agreement. Everybody says, oh, no, I know I can make more money if I cheated, but no, I put my word on the line. I'm going to forego the chance to make more money and stick to this agreement, help my competitors. Let's suppose we're that type of person. Well, now what kind of pressure might we face? External pressures. People who aren't party to the agreement. They may be people who aren't even in our business at the moment. They could be startup entrepreneurs. They could be huge companies making something different but see an opportunity. And in fact, the higher the price we've agreed to, the greater the attraction for somebody else outside the agreement to enter the business. Now, what are we going to, we're going to have another meeting. And because to handle this guy, what do we do now? We can break his arm, but you know, the chances are the cops will find out and we'll go to jail for that. Well, we can sit down with him and try to talk him into being a part of our agreement. Well, why would he want to do that? It's the fact that we've got one that he's making money. Well, and if we did succeed at convincing him to be a part of our secret agreement, all we've got is one more potential cheater on our hands. And what do we do when the next guy turns around? So this is, again, it's just like sand slipping through your fingers. It's a lot easier said than done. It's not going to stick. Through internal pressures and external pressures, these things tend to break apart. Now, we've seen this on a world scale with OPEC over the years. And I would argue that with OPEC, you had even additional advantages that would suggest they could possibly make something like this work because they're all government cartels. And they could always tax their people to death if they have to make up for losses in the oil business, whereas a private company can't do that. And yet OPEC gets undercut all the time. The last really huge round of price increases before the recent ones, remember back in the 70s, what did those higher prices do? Well, they brought new countries online, North Sea oil from Britain and Venezuela and some Indonesia oil and so forth, and which in time broke the back of OPEC, and we were getting $10 oil for quite a while. I have every reason to believe that high oil prices today are having some of that same effect. We will not see the full effect of it perhaps for a time, but you can bet the higher prices are causing a lot of people to say, this alternative now may be feasible. Let's bring it online, or let's dig a little deeper because at that price it's affordable to find oil in deeper places. What's necessary to make that all happen is for the market to be left alone, for there to be freedom to take advantage of these high prices and harness the power of incentive to produce more, find alternatives, and what have you. The same sorts of forces that were in work that took us from whale oil to crude oil in the first place. It was not a Department of Energy that did that. A final charge is a general one leveled against not just Standard, but big companies in general. And that is that the big guy can charge any price he wants. Bigness in business is inherently bad because by sheer size, you have certain powers that other firms don't have, and that includes the power to charge and get any price that you want. If that were the case, you'd never have such a thing as bankruptcy, right? No big firm would ever go bankrupt because they just raised the price. Why didn't firms that went bankrupt think of that? Well, I'm sure they did. The competition takes a lot of forms in the marketplace. One is free entry, and here's where government can do a lot of things to stifle competition. They can do things that prevent or stifle free entry through such things as even a general tax policy. It may seem to be general upon everybody and not favoring anyone in particular, but if the tax rates are very high, that tends to hit the newcomer and the small guy harder than the established firm, because the new guy taking the risk for the first time says, why bother? The chance of reward at the most critical moment in my company's history is just not high enough to be worth the risk. A very high tax, heavy regulatory environment has the disproportionate negative effect on small companies that stifle competition. The big guy can usually find ways to cope with it that the little guy or the newcomer has difficulty. So you can stifle free entry just by making the system rigid through high taxes, excessive regulation, and over-politicizing an economy. Foreign competition. Milton Friedman is famous for saying, if you're concerned about what a domestic company might be able to do to you because it gets big, just open the borders. Foreign competition will discipline them, much as it did American automakers in the 1970s. Competition of substitutes. Sometimes our perspective on competition is so narrow, we forget that companies compete with each other even when they're not making the same thing. I remember, actually this is the example I'm thinking of goes to the next form of competition, which is competition of all goods for the consumer's dollar. In one sense, competition is so broad-based, all firms are competing against all other firms, no matter what they're making, for the consumer's dollar. And a good example goes back to a friend of mine who taught at Northwood University. He told the story of teaching an extra class one semester, and he came into, I think it was $1,500 extra bucks that term. And he said he and his wife were kicking around, what do we do with the $1,500? And he wanted to take a vacation to Florida, and she wanted a new washer and dryer and a couple other things. And he said in that case, United Airlines was in direct competition with Maytag. And in that case, Maytag won too, by the way. But there's an example, competition of all goods for the consumer's dollar. Well, I said that was the last charge, but I forgot. I do have one other one. This is the one that sticks in my craw more than any of them. You have people in some of these textbooks who say, well, Rockefeller was greedy. He was just greedy. We needed to break him up just because he was greedy. We kind of looked into why he was doing all this, and lo and behold, it wasn't just to help us out, it was because he wanted to make money. And that's just greed, and he should have settled for less and not let his company grow as much and not satisfy consumers as much as that's what, in effect, they're saying. They're saying he was a greedy man. They don't even look at things like how he spent his money. I think this is a very difficult area to make judgment calls about people anyway, but some of the same folks who make that charge will not tell you that he tithed throughout his life, that he was the first American to give away $1 billion. If you've ever visited his gravesite outside of Cleveland, you'll see there's a marker there. And I remember reading it and I thought, well, that's nice, but clearly the person who wrote that inscription thought that Rockefeller was a greater man for what he gave away than for what he created in the first place. If I'd been writing it, I would have said, here lies a great man who provided hundreds of thousands of jobs, who flooded the world with an improving and ever lower priced quality product, who allowed American industry to dominate much of an important market worldwide, carried American goods on ships to nearly every country on the planet, and then, by the way, he made a lot of money and gave some of it away. That's what I'd write. I would say it was almost incidental that he gave it away. I admire him for earning it in the first place. It's easy to give stuff away. What a lot of these critics of Rockefeller would never admit is they don't know how to make it in the first place, but they love to criticize people who have. and not acknowledge how much of it they gave away. So I think greed is a matter between you and your maker. And only your maker and maybe you know your full motivation. But I do know this, that in a free market, if you want to make more money, you can't put a crown on your head and wrap a robe around yourself and say, well, I'm the queen, cough it up. People will say, what's in it for me? What are you going to do for me? You have to actually serve the customer. You have to produce something. And you better do it better than others or you'll be history. That's the genius of the free market. As we mentioned in one of the student classes yesterday, there are countries and regimes over the years that have railed against profit and self-interest. The communist countries did it all the time. And they always said, you know, we're going to make these things out of just concern for our fellow man. You know, it'll be the people's factory and we'll produce not for profit but for the people. Lo and behold, they don't produce squat and very little that's worth anything on the world market. When you think of it, it's really miraculous how the market does these things so well in the absence of central planners. Take televisions. I remember, do you know what the #1 cause of fires in Moscow apartments was during the Soviet Union period? #1 cause of fires in their apartment buildings? Soviet-made television sets blowing up. I mean, they were absolutely awful quality. These were television sets made in government factories by government employees, directed by government commissars who said, oh, aren't we great? We're commissars. The people want entertainment, and so the government will provide it. Well, they blew up their apartments, is what it amounts to, and very little in the way of quality anything, programming or what have you. Here in the U.S., nobody's in charge by government. Nobody's told at gunpoint, you make television sets. The peasants want entertainment. Make those TV sets. Nobody's told to do that. If nobody made a television set, nobody would go to jail for it. So people are all doing it because there's some self-interest, profit motive involved. And compare the two. In which country do you get the best television sets with the best programming? The place where the government says we're going to be in charge and make sure it happens, or the place where if it doesn't happen, nobody's penalized? It's all incentive. It's obvious, isn't it? Well, I guess what I need to do is to finally offer a quick comment on the 1911 Supreme Court dissolution of the Standard Trust and then open it up to Q&A. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil into several constituent parts, claiming that there was less competition between the parts that became Standard than there was when the parts were separate independent companies. Now, how does that strike you? It's common sense, isn't it? What the Supreme Court said, these were not economists, by the way. It's amazing how the other side says, the Supreme Court, we hate them when we talk about the Dred Scott decision, but boy, they got it right on this one. They're not economists, and all they decided was Standard bought up a lot of parts, a lot of companies that now became part of the Standard Oil Company. And now that they were part of one company, there was less competition between them than there was when they were separate independent companies. Well, of course. But what does that say, if anything, about the general level of competition? Nothing. It says nothing about it. It doesn't say anything about what the trust faced in the way of outside competition. But because the court found that it was a restraint of competition to buy firms, bring them in, and now they're part of one company, less competition than there was if they'd been kept separate and independent, this is bad, violates the Sherman Antitrust Act, and a Standard should be broken up. So it was a very flawed decision that didn't even take into account the fact that the market had already whittled away at Rockefeller's market share by more than 20 percentage points from 1890 until that 1911 case. So anyway, wasn't the first time, won't be the last time that the Supreme Court made a mistake. That's all I have to say. If we have a few time for some questions, I'll be happy to take them. And thank you for being so attentive in a very warm room. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Rodney.
It seems to me that when you hear of people in government claiming that companies make too much or have too market share and so forth, that I have a theory that what is really going on here is that people are very envious of what is happening.
Yeah.
And that their envy is actually causing them to suggest to other people things of that nature, to make that kind of argument, to get them to be envious too.
Yeah.
To basically try to tear down what has been built. Could you
Yeah.
address that?
Oh, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of envy in this, simply wanting to go after somebody who's more successful than you, and there's a lot of political demagoguery, scoring of points. Politicians who don't know their economics, are more interested in getting reelected. They have to have a boogeyman out there, so they say, he's evil. Let's do something to him. So they can rally an uninformed public and score some political points. That happens all the time. Jesse Jackson has raised that to an art. He shakes down company after company, just demagoguing these issues. So yeah, a lot of it is envy, and a lot of it is demagoguery. And I think, generally speaking, in America, our levels, our standards of respect for property have fallen to the point where it doesn't take much for somebody to stake a claim on it. How many of you saw that movie Cinderella Man? If you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. I want to write a little article based on a moment in that movie that really struck me. And I just thought of it because we're talking about envy and sanctity of property and what have you. If you saw it, do you remember early on when Braddock's boy steals some sausage? They're in the depth of the Depression, and the little boy's even concerned that maybe the family would have to take the kids and put them elsewhere because they can't afford to keep them. Terrible situation. The boy steals a sausage, but what does Braddock, his father, do? He doesn't try to cover up for it. He immediately, not a moment's hesitation, he takes the boy with the sausage, they go back to the butcher, and he has the boy deliver it and apologize. And then outside the butchery, he lectures the boy and he says, "We don't steal. Doesn't matter what the circumstances, we don't steal." Do you understand that? And I thought, wow, what a powerful lesson. And even later, when Braddock himself feels compelled to go on relief for a time, what does he do at the earliest opportunity? He gives it back. He gives the money back. I don't know how many Americans would do that today. But in a day when people think that if somebody else has more, you're somehow entitled to a portion of it, there'll be lots of demagogues preying upon envy, and that's how they make their political living. And we see it all around us.
Maybe time
Yes.
for one more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
This may be another myth that you could bust with respect to Standard Oil, but I can recall a few decades ago sitting in a lecture hall and hearing one of the stories being that as competition grew for Rockefeller and oil was being carried by railroad.
Oh, he got
demanded a
rebates.
rebate,
Yes.
for first lower prices than his competitors got, and
Yes.
then actually a rebate on his competitors' load.
Yeah, this has been examined too. The idea that because he was so big, he got rebates from railroads. Well, what was happening here was Rockefeller he was an incredibly shrewd bargainer. He told the railroads, if you want to ship my oil, you better cut your price. He didn't have the power to compel them, force them at gunpoint to ship at, he just squeezed as low a price out of them as he could, and he did that by telling them, I will build the loading and unloading facilities. You don't have to build that. I'll provide my own insurance. You don't have to worry about that. So slash your price. Oh, that's not low enough. You better do it even lower. And then he would often say, as time went on, he said, if you don't cut your price, I'll just build pipelines and I'll carry my oil that way. And increasingly he did that. He was just a shrewd bargainer with the railroads, none of whom was ever required to ship his oil. But to get his business, because it was such large volume, they gave him the best deal. So really that charge that he got rebates and that was somehow unfair it's another red herring, and it's really an accusation against his competitors who either weren't shrewd enough bargainers or didn't have the wherewithal to bargain for the lowest price.
Do you know if he got rebates on his competitors' loads?
I know that that's sometimes argued that he did. I don't know the details of that, but yeah, yeah. I'm not sure about that, but I am sure that because he didn't have the power to compel a railroad to haul his stuff, he was just the shrewdest of bargainers and got the lowest price. And his empire, by the way, increasingly relied less and less on railroads and more on the pipelines that he built himself.
Aren't the railroads kind of an Alice in Wonderland world anyway, when it comes to government regulation and competition and all that?
Yeah. Well, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ethel
And
May.
thank you. You didn't know I had one more smart son, did you? We're looking forward to seeing you all at the luncheon, and where Larry's going to speak about public policy. And I think I ought to give him at least 20 minutes to sit down before he has to talk again.
Okay.
So, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.